It's quite surprising how, despite the strong links between Britain and between Sudan, on many, many levels, and for generations, whether it be through colonial presence or whether it be through students, Sudanese traveling to the UK and gaining their education, such as your father, for instance, and yourself, or Brits going to Sudan and learning Arabic and various other disciplines. I mean, I recall that doing my first and master's degrees in linguistics and translation studies, most of my tutors had gained their Arabic degrees in Sudan, a country that is, vegetation and fruit and wheat and the such in abundance, a culture so rich, diverse, and the people so sweet, so amiable. So how is it possible that not only in such idyllic surroundings, how could a civil war as brutal as we've seen on our screens happen, but how is it also that we know so little of internal Sudanese political, military, strategic dynamics, that virtually everyone seems to have been, absolutely shocked by the prospect that we find ourselves here today. It's something that's been playing on my mind for a while now, since this conflict started. But if I was to ask you about how we could look at this and try to understand why it is that the conflict started, and why is it proving so brutal, so bloody, so tough on the eye, as well as on the senses, and obviously extremely tough on the Sudanese people? Where would you start with trying to answer that?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me today and for your very kind words, which I think you've actually summarized in a way very well the complexity, but also shed some light on where some of that complexity arises from. And I would make a claim that part of the issue is that when you speak about, say, the Sudanese graduates who came for postgraduate training in Britain, or those who went for Arabic language training in Sudan, when you look at it carefully, you are looking at one dimension of Sudan. I don't want to use the word class, but one dimension and one particular component of Sudan. And that's a component which was largely created, let's say, or molded by history, the history of the British
colonial middle classes.
Yes, and the very limited education system which was left behind, which covered a small number of people within certain areas of the country. So therefore, all this which is now coming as a surprise, this boiling and explosion, could be actually part of birthing pains. Very overdue, but they've been bubbling under the surface for years, if not for decades. But because largely in the peripheries of the country, not entirely recognized by someone who might have not had the chance to wander outside the center of capital Khartoum. So, and I think that's probably why people have been, in a way, caught by surprise. And this doesn't extend just to yourself. It also extends to people who should have been a lot more informed, such as diplomats or representatives of the international community on the ground. But then again, this is the sphere within they largely move and operate. And therefore, they've all been caught by surprise, at least from what we're seeing.
But it is true that when we're talking about Sudan, we are talking about a country that possesses incredible strategic interest and strategic importance and significance. I spoke about the futile soils, and I talk about the human resources, and I talked about the cultures coming together and marrying within the Sudanese community, but also the location of Sudan. If you look at the map, not only of Africa but of the entire region, in fact the entire world, it is of incredible importance, and therefore I think I'm safe in assuming that we're talking about a location which attracts the attention of various powers of various sorts.
True.
Political, military, agricultural, financial, and the such.
Absolutely, because if you go back in time, say before the breakup of the Soviet Union, Sudan then was the 8th largest country in the world area size.
Yeah.
Having said that, at the time the population was somewhere about 30 million, so very underpopulated, and largely concentrated along the banks of the Blue, White Nile, and the Nile, and other fertile regions. So it's a vast country, and even after the independence of South Sudan, it went from the 1st largest country in Africa to the 3rd. That's still a huge area, which is probably equal to France and Spain, and probably even Germany combined. So it's a vast
area. With such a small population.
With a population of about 40 million, largely very young, but still very diverse. Before the breakup of Sudan into Sudan and South Sudan, we had probably somewhere in the region of 150 languages and dialects, about 560 different tribes. So there's a lot of diversity there. But this is a diversity that, in a way, rather than becoming necessarily a blessing or sense of force, sense of power for the country, it has become there's a lot of friction at the moment. And this is where a lot of this is rooted in, even though it might come across on the news as a tussle or power struggle between two generals. There's a lot more going underneath, and a lot of it is related to history, a lot of it which can be quite complex and detailed, that you start to feel as if you're going into a mental maze and you're losing your way trying to navigate it. So I can understand that sometimes it's easier to look at that rosy picture of the educated elite who mix with the international community and organizations who travel abroad, the middle class, as you kindly
But you'd barely be scratching the surface of what
exactly.
you're saying.
It's a lot more complicated and complex beneath. And that is pretty much what's happening now. And because of that complexity, I would say that perhaps lots of observers, lots of commentators, lots of people who've been activists in relation to Sudan were probably more comfortable keeping it that way. But because they neglected the other complexities, it was allowed to bubble on and to boil through chronicity and become more complicated until it just got to a point where it was no longer sustainable.
So if we were to move to more contemporary times, by far and large, am I correct in assuming that for the past 30, 40, probably even 50 years, the military have been quite prominent in public life? Is that correct?
Yes.
We have had generals, one after the other,
yes,
as being presidents
yes,
of Sudan. The most recent and the most talked about, obviously, is Omar al-Bashir, who was deposed in
2019.
In 2019, in what was, now this is where it gets a little bit complicated. I'm going to call it a military coup. Would I be correct?
I would tend to agree with you because, yes, there were popular protests from December 2018 all the way to April 2019, where there was the major sitting outside the headquarters of the army in the center of Khartoum. But effectively, what really led to the overthrow of al-Bashir was an internal military coup, because the country was taken over by a council of army and security officers.
Now, again, the impression that we got was that this military coup had a significant popular backing. There was the streets of Sudan by far and large, or at least those were the images and the reports that came our way to London, were celebrating the fact that the regime headed by Omar al-Bashir, which was in power for what, 30 years?
Just under 30 years, yeah.
Had been kicked out, basically. So that's why my hesitation when I call it by far and large or outright a military coup, because there was quite a significant popular backing to this change, was there not?
So yes, and again, going back into history, every time we've had a popular revolution, I mean, the Sudanese, we always like to claim that we had the first popular revolutions in the Arab world way before the Arab Spring. In October 1964 and in April 1985. But they followed a very similar pattern. Popular protests culminating in the military siding by the people or carrying out enforcing the last bit of change, enforcing out the man in power.
Right.
And therefore, that would seem to look on the streets that there's popular support of the armed forces. And the armed forces are generally well respected in Sudan by the man on the street because they're still seen as a national institution. Plus, Sudanese society is remarkably highly politicized. If you go to any social gathering, it's either politics or football that people are talking about. Okay. And therefore, there is a sense of politicization in the military establishment. So they have quite a high level of political awareness, very acute, and they're not detached from what goes on in Sudanese society.
It's not like the situation, let's say, in Egypt or in Syria.
I think it's very different. It's very different.
I mean, the generals you'd find mingling with lay people.
You'd find them in the marketplace, in the malls.
So in a way, we're not talking about the sort of binary picture of the army versus or in parallel but totally detached from the population.
No, I disagree with that kind of classification, because even when the army, again, quote unquote, took over in 1958 and in 1969 and in 1989, the three times, even though ideologically they seem different, but every time it was actually politicians instigating that change.
Right.
So that kind of reflects at how much politics goes on within the army, and it's very closely related to other political events within the country.
Right.
So the army is affected by the currents within the country, and they are well known that many army officers have their own political views and beliefs. Perhaps they don't speak about it, but that reality is there.
If I may, I mean, regarding the protest that took place in 2018 and ended in April 2019 with the disposition of the regime of Umar al-Bashir, why was that? I mean, what were the grievances held against the regime that ruled for 30 years again? Yeah.
Well, first of all, 30 years is quite a long time. And ever since the independence...
But there were elections, no?
There were elections, and though official bodies such as the African Union, the Carter Center had all kind of signed them off as free and fair, there were widespread allegations of irregularities and rigging and so on and so forth, and boycotting as well. But also, since the independence of South Sudan in 2011, Sudan entered a spiral of quite deep economic crisis. Right. So when the protests actually started in December, it was directly related to a hike in the price of bread, about threefold in a number of Sudanese towns. That was the very beginning of it. Now, the heavy-handed approach by the security forces obviously inflamed the situation further. There's a lot of talk and speculation, obviously, that there were insiders within the regime who were tired of the leadership. They wanted a change. They were finding it difficult. There was the 2020 elections coming up. And within the ruling party itself, there were lots of calls that enough is enough, that al-Bashir, you've had your, well, more than 3 consecutive terms. Maybe it's time for young blood and somebody else to change. And that kind of tussling within the inner circles. So that also helped build the momentum and lead to the change.
Now the reason why I asked this question is because during the latter part of al-Bashir's rule, he carried out certain measures which I understand came back and right now are parts of the components of the civil war. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And the major measure would be the introduction of the Rapid Support Forces, which are led by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, well known as Hemeti. These were forces, light forces, particularly armed with 4x4 pickups and light artillery and middle-range artillery. But they were mainly in the periphery, particularly in the Darfur region. And they've got a very long history. Listeners and followers here in the Western world will particularly recognize the name of the Janjaweed militia. Right. That's where they came from in the early part of this, the 21st century. Yeah. Now, these forces were in Darfur. They were very decisive in fighting some of the Darfurian movements and certainly decimated a lot of their forces. So al-Bashir called them into Khartoum because he was, as I said, this inner dissent within the party. He was worried, perhaps even paranoid, that the army would move against him. So he called them into Khartoum to guard the main installations around the general command because he was wary, and he probably was right in the end, that a military coup would be carried out. But what happened was absolutely they participated in it, and even though the generals at first kept al-Bashir under house arrest within his residence in the general command of the army, they took him to Cordoba prison, which is the country's oldest prison, very famous for keeping political prisoners. And they became, or Hemeti became, a member of the Military Transitional Council, which came to power in April 2019. And obviously he was now effectively occupying strategic areas within the capital. Yeah. He had a strong force, very resourceful, because these were the forces which had participated in the war in Yemen. So there was a lot of money in their coffers. And they were now in control of gold mining regions, artisanal gold mining regions in Darfur. This force now, rather than being used as a paramilitia attached to the army, under the command of the army, was now able to sit on the negotiating table, to the extent that even within this transitional military council, within 48, 72 hours, Hemeti was saying these generals need to leave the council, and they did, and there was a change. And this is why his current opponent, General Abdul Fattah al-Burhan, who was the Inspector General of the army, rather than being just a member of that council, became the chairman of the council.
Wow. Okay, so we come to April 2019, and it seems to the outsider, like myself and many others, it seems that things are looking up for Sudan, because the students' protests, the workers' protests have culminated in a change of regime. And we have here, I remember there being a number of names which I personally wasn't familiar with at the time. Hemeti, al-Burhan, and there was a Hamdouk. So those three gentlemen seemed to be, okay, they seem to have come together, and they were talking about a Sudan that was going to be prosperous, that was going to be open to the world, that was going to get rid of the ills that had shackled the country and the nation down for several decades. So things were looking up. But what happened?
So that's a very good description of what it looked like. It was certainly this sense of positivity, this rosy future that, and one term or phrase which was used quite a lot, we're going back into the fold of the world after so many years of isolation, coming in from the cold and so on. Hamdouk, Abdullah Hamdouk, he's an economist by training and profession. But he's pretty much a technocrat, though it's widely believed in his earlier years, useful as he was probably a member or close to the Sudanese Communist Party. But he's worked his way up within different institutions with the African Union and in different African economic institutions. Now, the irony again was a year prior to the fall of al-Bashir's regime, he was widely tipped to be the country's finance minister.
Wow.
And so his name wasn't totally unknown to the Sudanese public because of the huge publicity about him possibly becoming finance minister, which is interesting. I mean, if you believe in a conspiracy theory, you might think somebody's been priming the stage for this. And he certainly was, in a way, a break, because a soft-spoken man who well-educated, Western-minded. He knew how to talk with the international community. He was received to much acclaim in the UN General Assembly and institutions in Washington and so on. But then again, that's very much, if you take a step back, very much similar to the picture you mentioned at the beginning
about the education system and
exactly
the educated class.
Yet outside of Khartoum, you could see things were boiling.
Yeah.
Because there were many major political mistakes made by the main body, which is known as the Freedom and Change Coalition. They wanted, or they came in with the illusion that we're just going to overturn 30 years of tyranny and repression, and just with one stroke of the pen, cancel everything out. Yeah. They didn't look at countries develop, societies develop, for better or worse, but there are factors, anthropological, ethnic, socioeconomic factors. None of this was looked at deeply. It was all the thinking was concentrated within Khartoum. And this is why the first signs of danger, let's say, started to become apparent when different parts of the country, bloodshed was breaking out. There was civil strife, there were blockades, because the peripheries, over 30 years, one of the major things that al-Bashir's regime had done was there was widespread deregulation of power, and a federal system was put into place because of the diversity of the country. So you can't imagine overnight going back to a very centralized system, which seems to be the spirit with which things were carried out. That was one thing. The other thing was, whereas al-Bashir was a military officer, he was largely backed up with a political apparatus of a political party. But what had happened after April 2019...
Congress.
Yes. What happened after April 2019 was that the FFC, the Forces of Change, who led the protests, they introduced the army as a political partner. And I think they were largely immature politically, I'm sorry to say, not very experienced. They were largely activists who thought running a country as diverse and complicated as Sudan was as simple as the student unions that they'd been involved with. But it's a much, much more difficult business. But without going into too much boring detail, but these mistakes obviously culminated in an imperfect alliance. There was quite a lot of mistrust. And then you had the other problems where there were still parts of Sudan where there was remnants of the civil war of Darfur, how to deal with peace arrangements, and you have lots of armed groups. And then that all, again, reflects in the division or distribution of power and wealth. So there was a peace agreement. And that rosy picture I spoke about, part of it was that now that al-Bashir has gone, we're going to have peace overnight. We're going to have, all the resources we need. But it's a lot more complicated than that. And slowly, the realities of long years of civil strife started to come. Because when they went to Juba for the agreement with the Darfurian groups, that meant there was a certain distribution. That meant the balance of power between the forces of change and the army was changed. And this is where political maneuvering starts to come in and positioning. And that, in the end, effectively culminated in the military coup that al-Burhan carried out in October 2021. Now, this has all led to where we are here now because the international community, the Troika, which is Norway, the US and the UK, and the Quad Group, which is the US, UK, Saudi Arabia and Emirates, have been trying to get these partners back together. But the trouble has come when they went through the details, and again, as I say, the devil's in the details. One of the details was emerging, because obviously you have a national army, you can't have all these militias in peacetime.
Correct.
So integrating them back into the national army. This was the straw that broke the mule or the donkey's back. But we always look at the straw, but what I was trying to paint there was that there was a huge load already there. It just needed that straw. And the straw was the issue of integration of these armies. The Sudanese army said this is basically a technical issue. 2 years should be enough. The rapid support forces were opting for 10 up to 14 years. And they had some political
support. What was their drive? What was their motivation? Why were they insisting on... Well, to be honest, I think it was a ploy. I mean, because I don't think that even proposing 10 years, I don't think that that was even serious. It was just to delay matters and put them on the back burner. I think that there was a real objective not to merge with the armed forces. I might be wrong, but what was their reasoning for refusing the 2-year solution and going for a far longer one?
So there's always been this kind of scarecrow which has been put up to scare people, that any rapid transition followed by elections will mean the National Congress and the Islamists are going to come back, because they're the most well organized, they're the most resourceful, and they're still present, and they have a deep state within the country.
Right. Okay.
So the forces of change have always been pushing that we need to uproot the remnants of the old regime, and we need to cleanse the civil service, the diplomatic service, and the military, where they have a strong presence, and uproot them out. But what they hadn't realized, again, 30 years, yes, okay, it might have been the Islamists who started those 30 years, but over the 30 years, they did not rule on their own. They had wide-ranging alliances, even including forces who later on became part of the FFC, and wider relations with Sudanese society, with the tribal structure, with traditional...
In fact, if anything, as you earlier mentioned, it was al-Bashir who introduced the rapid force to public life. I mean, he introduced them to Sudan.
Yes.
Yeah. And Hamidti was seen as a very strong political ally of al-Bashir.
Yes, absolutely. And even within the days of the popular protest, there was a lot of fear that Hamidti might move against the protesters.
In favor and in support of al-Bashir.
Yes.
Right.
And when, for example, the tragic events of the 2nd of June 2019, where there was a violent disruption and clearing of the sitting happened, and possibly 200 plus lives were lost, fingers still point to Hamidti as being responsible for that massacre. But then again, the popular will to put him back, let's say, in where his sphere should be, rather than being a political actor, hasn't just not been there. And this again has come back again now, where it seems some parts of the FFC who believe that the revolution was not complete because it didn't have an armed wing. I mean, we have, obviously, as you know, Sudan is rich with its political spectrum, but we still have people who are still held by romantic notions of this leftist revolution, which has to be an armed revolution, as we've seen in other parts of the world. Some of them are quite outspoken. They've been speaking that the revolution didn't have any teeth. We didn't have an armed wing. And some of them was actually, such as Yasser Arman, who's interestingly, people now think of him as somebody who's quite bad luck, because every political movement he's joined has ended up in disarray.
Dear, dear.
But he was getting close to the Hamidti clan and family, and he was actually making gestures that the RSF could be the nucleus for the new national army. Now, when you're an army officer listening to all of this is not going to go down very well.
Absolutely.
And if you add that to the fact that you're asking for 10 years to integrate into the national army, the question comes up, why so long? Unless you are now becoming a tool which is useful for other political actors. So this whole introduction of armed groups, the officers, into mainstream political life is basically the main root of this. Whereas the political forces could have nudged them out. They've introduced them, and they've now used them as leverage to settle out their competition with their political opponents.
Now, the way you're describing this reminds me, and I hail from Iraq, reminds me very much of what we've had for the past 20 years since the occupation of Iraq, and that is the presence of militias, ideological militias, sectarian militias, political militias, but militias nonetheless. And these militias are either doggedly ideological or sectarian, or guns for hire. And we go even before then, and we look at Lebanon, and the fact that Lebanon has, for the past probably 60, 70 years, one could argue 60 years, hasn't really had a proper state, simply because of the presence of guns that aren't regulated by the umbrella of an armed forces, that no one outside has the right to carry. So are we also, I mean, we call them the rapid forces, but in a way, am I correct when I describe them as sort of a militia or as even a semi-militia?
Yeah, I agree. It is a militia. It's a militia, the leadership of which is based in a family. I mean, the commander in chief is Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo.
Yes.
His deputy is his brother, Abdurrahim Dagalo.
Right. Okay.
His cousin is the head of the intelligence department of the militia. It largely hails from his clansmen from a certain group of the Zagat tribe, not all of the Zagat tribe, and a lot of his soldiers come from the wider sub-Saharan belt, which extends through Darfur, Chad, Niger, and Mali, because that's where these ethnically Arab nomadic tribes hail from. And that, again, is a reflection of the chronicity of the struggles in the area.
Yeah.
These were struggles where tribes, the nomadic tribes being nomadic and Bedouin, would move with their animals depending on dry or rainy season, looking for pasture and water. But that was what led them to clashes which were with, quote unquote, the African pastoralist tribes. But because these things were left to fester for so long, gradually, and with the other issues of famine and drought and climate change in sub-Saharan Africa, with regime and political strife in Chad and Libya over the years, it became more weaponized.
Right.
So that is the background of this militia. And therefore, again, the future of this militia is a question. They do not have a political program. They do not have an economic ideology. They do not have a religion, say, faith system or sect system that they're still, even, they don't have total unanimous support of even the Zagat. The Zagat, for instance, in the last few weeks have distanced themselves from Hemeti. So they are largely a very glorified mercenary force. And you can see this in the type of company that Hemeti's kept.
Yeah.
He's been fighting in Libya with General Haftar. He has been fighting in Yemen. And only just a few months back, he was fighting in Central African Republic, and widely alleged that he was fighting side to side with the Russian Wagner mercenaries.
Yeah. Yeah.
He exports gold outside Sudanese channels, and it's been widely recognized. It's no longer just a simple allegation that this
And we're
gold,
talking about tons and tons.
talk about 26 tons at least of gold annually.
Yeah.
And this has gone...
Imagine all of this could have been for the Sudanese people.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, I have two questions in mind, and I'm struggling to decide which to ask first. But let me ask about, how did this round of the civil war, how did it start? Why did it start?
So there was a political framework agreement which was largely brokered by the UN mission, which is known as UNITAMS, and the Troika group and the Quad group. Now, therein again lies the issue. They were trying to get these different opponents, what was known as the military component, which was the RSF and the army, and the civilian component, which is the Forces for Change, back together again following the coup which al-Burhan had carried out against them in October 2021. And that, I think, is where the problem is again, because this insistence that Sudan is only these two components is a deeply flawed one. And the insistence in still excluding other actors, either the Islamists with their diverse groups and parties and groupings, but also other national actors who had been working with the previous regime or had not been, let's say, didn't have too much animosity towards the previous and had reached the power-sharing deals and so on. This insistence to bridge them together again, I think, is largely to blame. This is a flawed approach which should have been rethought again. It's a lazy approach. And certainly, I think there's been a lot of disquiet in lots of Western circles, so not very obvious that things should have been rethought properly. But that voice is still more murmurs and mumblings here and there. And then, as I said, when they wanted to bring this political framework, there was a framework agreement signed in December last year, and then a number of workshops on how to proceed. And it was the sticking point, certainly, or the flashpoint, was again the reform of the army and the question of integration of the RSF into the army. That was the flashpoint which blew things apart.
And since then, now it's been nigh on 10 days, 12 days, and we're seeing the scale of destruction and of damage, not only to buildings and installations, but to people's lives. And in the whole, we can talk about politics, we can talk about all of this, but ultimately speaking, it's the ordinary Sudanese on the streets of whether it be the capital Khartoum or in the various provinces that are suffering immensely as a result. So let me ask the second question that I was struggling with whether and how to ask. But my interest is, as you're describing the rapid forces, I'm asking myself, where do they get their weaponry, their military support, their ammunition, their logistical support and the such? Where did they get that from?
So initially, because they were militia formed under the guidance of the army, that would have been there. But ever since their participation in Yemen, I think it's widely recognized that they've received a lot of modern weaponry, transport vehicles and machines, and certainly a very advanced communication system. Now, nearly pretty much all commentators and people interested in Sudan are pointing their fingers towards pretty much the United Arab Emirates. Partly because of the Emirates' role in Yemen, and partly because of the closeness of the Hemeti family to the UAE. There have been allegations that even before these last events, that Hemeti was actually in the UAE for at least 2 to 3 weeks. And the other thing was there was widespread talk, which I recall hearing back in 2019, that when al-Bashir regime fell, there were suggestions being made by the UAE that perhaps the Sudanese army should be disbanded, something similar to what happened in Iraq, for instance, and that a new national army should be formed based on the RSF. Obviously, this was part of the Islamists are controlling the Sudanese army. It can't be reformed, let's totally disband it. And some commentators and observers observed at the time that there was pushback against this from Egypt. Because the Egyptians were worried that any tampering with the Sudanese army would lead to a collapse of the Sudanese army, would lead to potential collapse of the Sudanese state. And that obviously is a huge threat to Egyptian national security, and also because of other regional politics, particularly in relation to Ethiopia and the Renaissance Dam and the Nile Waters Agreement and the balance of power there, because a total weakening of Sudan would tilt in the favor of Ethiopia, and the Egyptians, that to them is an existential threat.
What about the region, the closer? I mean, where would Ethiopia, for instance, where would it stand in this particular argument? And also Sudan's neighbors, Uganda, Chad and such, where would they be standing in all of this?
So the Ethiopians and specifically Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, it's widely thought that he is more sympathetic towards the RSF. In the sense that the RSF,
because of the Egyptian dichotomy?
Exactly, because it will probably weaken or keep the Sudanese army in check. And because of other also border issues, even though the international border between Sudan and Ethiopia has always been accepted and agreed upon, there's a vast area of fertile land called Al-Fashaga, straight on the border, where for many years there have been clashes between armed Ethiopian gangs who come down from the highlands, because Ethiopia has restricted arable land that it can cultivate because of its mountainous terrain. So a weakened Sudanese army is welcome within in the eyes of the Ethiopian government, and also because of the balance with Egypt, and certainly because of the strategic ties between the Egyptian and Sudanese army. And again, Egypt is keen on a stable Sudan, and because it also gives a vantage point for Egypt. And this is why we saw Egyptian officers and soldiers in the Merowe Air Base.
Day one.
Because they've been based there, they've had joint training maneuvers and exercises with the Sudanese army over the last perhaps 10 years or so. Chad would be very, very worried about what's going on in Sudan because, as I said before, the RSF, many of its soldiers hail from Chad and from Niger and Mali.
And Chad borders Sudan from the Darfur.
From the Darfur on the west.
Yes. Where the Arab nomads and the such, they constitute a threat.
A threat, and because there's a delicate balance again between the Zaghawa, where President Deby hails from, and other Arab tribes, and the Quran, and that's always been there's always been that delicate power balance. So if Hemeti was to get too powerful in Sudan or Khartoum, he would form a threat in Chad, and likewise the Darfurian groups, especially the Zaghawa-based groups, they would be a threat to Chad. So Chad's been very, very worried, and certainly there are reports that it's sealed off its border. And there was a report 2 days ago that the Chad Military Council, which rules the country, has actually come out in support of the Sudanese army. The other region, which is or country worried, is going to be Libya. Again, the Libyan south is a vast area through the Sahara. It's very difficult to police. You've got Haftar there. He has an alliance with Hemeti. And interestingly, just before the breakout of these hostilities, Haftar's son was in Libya, was in Khartoum, and because he was given this honorary post of chairman of one of the two major Sudanese football teams. But it seems this was all just kind of a cover for a few meetings between some officers from Haftar's group and from Hemeti's militia.
Is it safe to assume that the Rapid Forces also received weapons from Haftar?
I've certainly heard that there have been movements seen at the southern Libyan airport of Al-Kufra, where there's a major base. There's been mention of convoys of transport vehicles coming across the desert from Libya as well.
Okay, map the scene right now. Where are we? What's happening? Because I understand that over the course of the past few days, the army has been relentless in targeting the Rapid Forces bases and to more or less restrict the battle zone now to the capital, which is devastating in itself, but still. But give us a very quick mapping of where we are from the battle zone perspective.
So if we go back to day one, which I think was Saturday, I think was it the can't remember the exact date, but anyway, the first day of the fighting, the RSF seemed to be in control of pretty much the whole of the capital and a number of military bases around the country. But remember, this is where we said they were already there. And it seems that the army was taken by surprise. And I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out, when history is written down, that it was the RSF who fired the first shot. But outside Khartoum, the battle has pretty much been decisively won by the Sudanese army. Certainly in eastern Sudan, in central Sudan. There remain a few areas in western Sudan, in Darfur, where there's still contested areas. The battle is largely pretty much now in Khartoum, and within Khartoum, pretty much central Khartoum, around the Republican Palace, around the General Command of the Army, and the neighborhood around there, and one particular base for the RSF, which is in Khartoum North. The Sudanese capital, Khartoum, is made up actually of 3 cities.
Right.
There's what's known as the national capital, the historical part, Durman, where lots of our listeners might have heard of the Mahdi of the 19th century. That's where his tomb is, and he started that camp. That has been largely a quiet region, though peripheries of that have had some fighting, but the major fighting is within the more modern political kind of capital of Khartoum itself, Khartoum proper. The airport, Khartoum International Airport, is still contested between both sides. Now, the Sudanese army has the relative advantage of its air force. But the trouble for them has been that the RSF forces, remember, rapid support, that name came because they're all on 4x4 pickups, very light on the ground. They've been dispersed within the neighborhoods. So air force is a bit challenging because we all know about the reality of precision strikes and the term of collateral damage and what that means in human cost. But the Air Force has been taking out their supply lines. And I would think, I mean, I'm not a military expert, but judging by what's playing out, it looks like they've been cutting off the supply lines and trying to squeeze supplies, food and fuel. Yesterday there was a report on Sudanese TV about that abandoned vehicles for the RSF were found because they were just empty of fuel.
Yeah.
And certainly there have been reports that some of them have been, because it seems that the army has been successful in taking out the communication and command structure that the RSF had. Therefore, some of their soldiers have been giving up their clothes and just dispersing. But perhaps the core is still within near the army headquarters and definitely the Republican Palace, where that fight is still going on. And
in regards with the numbers of victims, I mean, every time you listen to a news bulletin, the numbers are rising. And there seems to be a mass evacuation of Khartoum, people leaving their homes, heading towards either their relatives' residences outside of the city and the such. And the images that came back, I watched them before I came into the studio, and they were very eerie. They showed streets that were totally deserted in the middle of the day, almost no human movement, at least no civil human movement. And obviously with that, a fourth round of ceasefires, which has basically had the foreigners evacuated. Now, obviously, when I know from Iraq, and we followed so many wars, attacks, invasions, and the such in this particular region over the course of the past 20, 30 years. Once, when you talk about foreigners being evacuated, you're talking essentially about Westerners, aren't you? I mean, you're not talking about, the odd, Omani family, for instance, or the Jordanian businessman or the such. You're talking about foreigners who are the Americans, the Europeans, and the such. And rightly so, they need to be evacuated. But just so that we frame things correctly, that there are many innocent and bystanding people, whether they be Sudanese or non-Sudanese, who are still in harm's way.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's a heartbreaking aspect of all of this. I mean, the numbers are probably underestimates. We probably won't know the full toll of this for some time, but even these numbers are terrible.
Horrific.
I mean, over 400 people killed. Yeah. The majority are going to be civilians, a lot of them shrapnel, stray bullets, artillery shells. I've had members of my very extended family, our extended families are very extended
very extended families,
but
yes.
Who've died from shells landing in their courtyards while they've been sheltering. They've got nothing to do with the actual fighting. And the number of injured is huge. And then the other toll is that, unfortunately, just yesterday, an artillery shell landed in a medical center, which is managed by two of my ex-classmates. So the medical professionals are unable to get to hospitals, supplies in hospitals. And remember, Sudan was already an under-resourced country. Yeah. It already had its health challenges. Yeah. Everything was already limited. Pretty much maybe over 50%, 60, 70% of the hospital's capacity has been obliterated by the fighting, because you need the health professionals to go to the hospitals. They need to have the supplies. They need to be safe. That's not necessarily there. And this is, again, the trouble. If a lot is said about, all these international conventions and humanitarian law, but when you think you've got a militia and an army, what adherence are you going to have? And then that brings you again to the question of the people who've been evacuated. Yeah. One common theme I've heard speaking to Sudanese friends and family, there's this immense fear that, and they've been very specific in saying, once the Western civilians are evacuated, we're going to be left to our own needs.
It's going to be open season.
And even the evacuation itself has left a lot to be desired. Yeah. If you look at, for example, tweets coming out from the Sudanese Junior Doctors Association in the UK, we know at least of 75 NHS doctors who are stranded in the country. Some of them have not been able to be evacuated because some of them are not necessarily British citizens or British nationals. it has been said that if you have a stay permit or BRP, you should be allowed. But today I was just reading, and it was shocking to read that one of these doctors actually said I wasn't allowed to go. Yeah. And then there's a heartbreaking bit where, and certainly my own immediate family is affected, when you define that British citizens will be evacuated with their dependents, dependents doesn't include your elderly parents. Yeah. Now, imagine the situation that you have to make that decision, leaving your elderly parents behind. Yeah. It's awful.
Absolutely.
The airfield being used as well. It's all well and good when it comes out on the news that this airfield's being used to evacuate. It's 30 kilometers north of Khartoum. Yeah. You have to arrive there with your own means. Yeah. Now, traversing Khartoum is a very complicated business. Correct. Forget the checkpoints and everything else. Correct. And this is why lots of people said, well, if I can get to the airfield, I might as well just go to another town in Sudan. Yeah. It might be easier. Yeah. So it's been, I think it's been quite disappointing, to put it mildly. And certainly the business about dependents and elderly parents being left behind, or elderly dependents, that is heartbreaking. And when you look at the more rapid response of other European countries, it has created a lot of disillusionment, I would say, amongst the British Sudanese community, particularly the doctors, because they've been very vocal about this.
What's the world's position been on this Hamiti-Burhan conflict? Because essentially, I mean, what you're describing is heartbreaking. What you're describing, and I'm remembering what we just spoke about just a few minutes ago, about how rosy the picture was drawn and painted in only 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, upon the removal of the former regime, and how people were thinking of a future so bright and so beautiful. And yet here we are today talking about hundreds killed and countless injured, and people deciding whether to leave their elderly parents and to flee for their own safety with their children, or whether to stay behind. It's just absolutely heartbreaking. But where does the United States stand on this? Where does the government of Britain stand on this?
Well, when you look at their general statements, I mean, to me, it hasn't really gone very much beyond traditional
clichés.
I mean,
calling for calm.
Exactly. You'd be tempted to think it's a copy and paste from a document or statement about another country which was in strife, and therefore, my hunch, my personal feeling, my gut feeling, which I can't get rid of, is that it's going to be, let's see who prevails in this. And then we will deal with the de facto government or administration who prevails and take it from there.
Any chance of there being some sort of conciliation?
I think it's very difficult to see, because if you look at the statements coming out from the warring parties, they pretty much paint a zero-sum formula.
Yeah. And to be honest, zero-sum wars is what militias do.
Yeah, exactly.
Burning your bridges, by bombing the capital, how on earth could you rehabilitate someone who has contributed towards the death and destruction of the country? So, and it's scary. And you put it rightly, I believe, by evacuating the foreigners, it's now for them to settle. It's quite desperate. But I'm going to try to find some hope out of all of this, and say that what I started with, what I opened with in regards with the Sudanese people, I continue to cling on to that in terms of capacity for drive and energy and motivation and the sweetness of the character, of the ethos of the Sudanese. I'm still very, very hopeful and praying continuously that will prevail somehow. It's quite distressing when you describe what is essentially a civil war zone, and you talk about those with stakes all being outside of the country, none of them being inside of Sudan, none of them happen to be the 99.9% of the Sudanese people.
Absolutely.
They are all outside of Sudan who are benefiting one way or another from this conflict. But maybe soon, inshallah, soon we'll come back to talk about something.
Well, as Arab saying goes, if I crudely translate it, that the blessing or the grace of dawn is only seen after the darkest of the night.
Very, very true.
Hopefully we see that dawn.
Very, very.
If there's one thing to go back with, I think that sweetness that you speak of, that beauty, for it to come out, we can't use the same lights or reflections of the past. And therefore, we need a new path out.
Yeah.
Bringing these kind of patchy deals with those partners, I think has no future. We need to rethink where we're going to approach things once the hostilities stop. And from our own national Sudanese priorities and determination, not what our neighbors or regional powers might wish to see.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you very much.
Thank you.